All right, so let's jump right into it and figure out how do we actually align this content. And I feel like this was a really challenging concept to wrap my head around starting out when building layouts and building websites. I was always curious, how do I get everything centered and aligned, but then also create cool looking backgrounds and textures behind that content, but still keep it within the grid, right? So it is kind of a mind boggler, and especially as a beginner learning some of these CSS practices and margins and padding and how that all comes together. So let's get right into it. I'll show you how to do it, what to look for, and then maybe we can break it down and explain what's really happening behind the scenes. There's no other way to really start learning this stuff until we get into it. So the first thing I like to do, I really like to focus in on a good name that's short and noticeable, and when I see it, that I know I better be careful not to mess with this particular wrapper content, right? Because that's going to affect the entire website. So if I just did .row, right, because this is going to be a row and we're going to put stuff inside of our row. So it's a good way to think of it like that. But if I do this, this is what's used with Bootstrap. And so I don't want my styles to clash with theirs. So I like to do grow, which stands for global, but I don't want to be typing out that every single time. So I just do DG-row, something short and sweet. And anytime I see a G on any of my class names, I know that that's global, and I better be careful when I go to change it and look over the site, because that's going to change everything. So we start off with our class name. So what do we do? Well, we know typically we're going to jump between two things here. So we've got our header, but inside this header, or even the header, we could technically do this. Let's just do this to show the points here. So we've got our grow class here, and if we inspect this, and we can see that there. So there's nothing applied to it yet. So we come here. We don't necessarily need to worry about the display being blocked, but usually out of the gate, it will be blocked. So that's fine. And we'll cover that. There's another display method that I use for display property or value. So how do we make this work? The first thing that we need is we need a max width. So we want to know how wide do we want our content to be, and not get wider than that. So that's what our max width does. So the standard back in the day, maybe it was like 900 pixels or something. We can do that just to kind of illustrate this point and see what happens here. So we've got a max width. So we're going to have to do some things here with my screen so we can see this actually playing. So if you notice here on the very right-hand side, the color's a little different. So that's kind of our margin. And if we look where it's saying, if we inspect this with our new things that we learned about in the last video, so the G-row has a 900 width by 164 pixels tall. So that's fine. So if we wanted to really illustrate this point, since we've got the smaller screen size here, we could maybe drop this to 500 pixels. You can see this margin, right? See how that's kind of coming into play here. And what we want to do is this, and where I'm getting that color, so right here, here's a better way to do it. So you can see that margin, right? That's all the space that's extra, that's left over. It doesn't matter how wide I make this, all the space is left over here. That's all the extra margin. So the trickery of this really comes in with this margin property. So what we do, we can come here, let's just continue with our code. And if we said margin 0, well, that would zero it out. So there's no margin whatsoever. So we can still see, but there's still margin there. But I added margin 0, so what's going on? So this just means that there is no margin whatsoever on anything on this element, but there still will be margin because we only have a certain width on this element. So how do we center that? Well, we do something called auto. So we say, hey, take any of the remaining margin that we have and just auto it. Basically, even it out on both sides. That's the cleanest, most simplest way I can think of explaining it. Just take whatever you have left and divide it evenly, and that's what auto does. And so we can use auto for padding and other types of spacing, or we could use like a percentage or things like that. But so we just say, and this is so I know we're still learning CSS, so this might look a little confusing, but basically this is a shorthand. So we're saying the top and bottom and the left and right. And maybe it might make sense to kind of illustrate that. We can see that here. So we're saying the margin on the top is 0. So the very top here by weapons, right, there's nothing. And then on the bottom here, there's no margin. So if we were to put, let's put some margin so you can see that, what I'm talking about exactly. See how now we've got 20 pixels on the top and bottom. We can see that orange there, right? But then on the sides, we have auto. So let's look at this again. The top, there's 20. The bottom, there's 20. And then on the sides are auto. So take up whatever's remaining. So typically, I always set this as 0 because I don't want to apply any margin. I'm going to have other classes that will affect the margin on the very bottom. I kind of write my margins always on the bottom of elements, so I know that everything kind of flows from the top to the bottom, and it just leaves it a much cleaner and easier way to figure out things, and I'll explain the collapsing margins and stuff like that. But so for now, I know this is kind of more of the magic, and it still kind of took me a little bit to get familiar and understand what exactly was happening. So if you're still confused, that's okay. Just kind of go with it for now. Understand that we can write this out if we wanted to write it a little bit less. Write it like this, okay? So I know we haven't got into a lot of the CSS yet, but what this is essentially doing is think of our CSS properties and some of these we can write the shorthand. So when we can spell them out, right? So we've got bottom, left, right, top. Think of it like a clock, right? So the top here, top right would be like 3 o'clock, bottom 6 o'clock, and then left would be our 9 o'clock, and then up and down would be 12 o'clock. So think of it like that, like a clock. And so what I mean by that, we could write our margin like this. So we have our top, we have our right, we have our bottom, and we have our left, 9 o'clock. So, and this is just a shorthand, and so we can even get shorter. So maybe that's something that you can do. Go look that up on your own about the shorthand properties with margin and padding. So since this is basically the same thing here, we can just eliminate that and say, hey, here's our top and bottom, here's our left and right. And I know that's another concept to kind of get your head wrapped around, but for now, this is the shorthand version, and it's really clean and kind of easy to read as you get more familiar with that. So kind of an advanced topic, but look what we've learned so far. Pretty neat. Now we've got the basic container of a max width, and this is cool too. So we can start to increase this. Why don't we put like a background color here so we can see exactly what's happening? Oh man, that's bad. Let's lighten that up or something. So just so we can, for this purpose, so you can see what's happening. So this is our container, right? That is the max width of this row, and everything inside of it will always be in that max width. That's kind of how we can keep our other website containers that way. So I hope you found this interesting. We're going to build upon this. I do notice that this particular font I'm using is breaking outside of that container. So there are things with weird fonts that we need to be aware of too. Not all fonts play nice and stay in the way that you think that they would. But yeah, anyways, we'll get into more of the layouts with like Flexbox and floating and grid, and I'll show you how to really kind of narrow in on these containers, but or the layouts, but we need to know this container functionality really well. So try building one on your own. We don't necessarily need this display block. Most of the elements that we're going to be putting as a row should be a div or a block element by default. And really the two things that you need are just the margin and the max width. So play around with that, get that set up, and then I'm going to show you some other techniques and some other CSS. So we'll get into that in the next one. All right, later.